I'm Zhou in Beijing. China's economy has been described as a miracle, but no miracle can last forever. The country's economy is trying to make over and slow down, and the change could be painful and enduring.
And I'm Wang Mengmang. On today's show, China's top economic planner talks about boosting domestic consumption to keep the economy on track. All the latest from the CPPCC and MBC sessions to come.
The two biggest economies in the world, China and the U.S., are interdependent. We'll look at how their growing relationship has brought more trade tensions and disputes. I'm Philip Yen in Washington.
And I am Terry-Ann Chibet in Nairobi. Now, China is becoming a bigger player in the world economy, and we'll see how Chinese investment and cooperation in Africa is helping the continent's economic boom.
China's top economic planning body, the National Development and Reform Commission, held a press conference this morning. And our reporter Guanxin has been following this. For more details, let's talk to her. Well, Guanxin, you've been following this press conference, and the NDRC is usually closely watched during every year's CPPCC and MPC session because it makes and announces a lot of important economic policies. So what's fresh out of the Great Hall of the People?
Evening, Mama. Well, the NDRC Minister Zhang Ping said during the press conference that China will continue to rely on investment and consumption to drive future growth. Investment and consumption combined contributed 102.2% of GDP growth last year, while external demand dampened by sluggish economy in key export markets contributed minus 2.2%. Zhang Ping says expanding domestic demand will continue to be a long-term strategy for China for long-term growth.
Maintaining growth amid fledgling world economy. Zhang Ping, the head of China's top economic planner, says China's macro control measures have been a success to avert an economic downturn. This is being buoyed by robust domestic demand.
There are two key ways to extend the domestic demand. First, consumption should be the fundamental factor in creating economic growth. Second, investment should play a critical role at the same time. As I've mentioned that we need to adjust the economic structure, because based on the last 2 years' experience, the domestic demand contributed a lot. Consumption's pulling effect to the economy surpassed investments. It had been noted by the society and should be our target in the future.
The country is still facing challenges on how to sustain the economic growth momentum and improve the quality of growth. Zhang stressed that unsustainable and unbalanced factors still exist in the current growth mode, and he says reform of government itself is the key.
The importance of economic system reform, or the core issue, should be to deal with the relationship between the government and the market. That is, we should let the market to play the fundamental role in resource allocation, while government fine-tunes policy.
And during the press conference, Zhang Ping outlined as much as 8 reform priorities, including tax reform, pricing reform, energy and resources, institutional reform, income distributional reform, and the financial reform. But he didn't mention any specific reform except for the pricing reform of fuel. Currently, China may change the retail oil prices when international oil prices change by more than 4% over 22 working days, a very rigid scheme. Zhang Ping says the NDRC is studying a new mechanism to make it more flexible, and the 4% mark may be scrapped and 22 working days may be shortened to make the fuel pricing mechanism more market-oriented. So, Mama, in the future, maybe China's rising population of car owners don't have to stand in long queues overnight at gas stations to fill their tanks before the NDRC raises oil price. Back to you.
Of course, as active energy consumers, we do hope that day would come. And Guanxin, also let's talk about the urbanization. That issue has been put under the spotlight even before this year's MPC and CPPCC started. So what did the NDRC about how to make urbanization more scientific, more inclusive, and more sustainable?
Yes, urbanization was raised at today's press conference. Actually, a reporter asked whether China would push forward urbanization in an overly aggressive manner like campaign. Zhang Ping said China will focus on the quality of urbanization and advance urbanization in a prudent manner. And the NDRC is working with related government departments to compile a layout to guide the urbanization process, and it is expected to be released in the first half of this year. He also mentioned some of the guidelines. First is to expand the capacity of cities to accommodate industries, create employment, and provide public services and attract population. Second is to speed up the reform of China's household registration system to change the migrant workers into urban residents. And third is to conduct experimental projects and form a regional pattern and gradually expand to other parts of the country. Back to you, Mama.
All right, thank you so much, Guanxin, for your report, and we'll be checking with you again in the coming days. All right, now let's turn to some other issues. Amid the ongoing sessions of the NPC and CPPCC, there are quite some discussions about the role of a rising China and its possible contributions to the global system. Among them, how to avoid a currency war, a topic heated up recently with the quantitative easing going on in quite a number of countries such as US and Japan. Now, on that note, CCTV senior reporter Tian Wei talks to Zhu Guangyao on the sideline of the ongoing two political sessions in Beijing. Mr. Zhu is a CPPCC member and Chinese Vice Minister of Finance.
We certainly see the possibility of a currency war that was very much debated during the last G20 finance minister meeting. There's certainly a dangerous trend, isn't it?
Debate is there. That's whether just to focus on domestic macro policy and give direct impact to the domestic economy. But we know now that globalization made all countries is interconnected. But we hope in the current situation, particularly faces as big challenge. Now that supply is higher than demand. We must have a way to solve this problem, to keep global economy back to the right track.
China is now trying to find its specific position as a rising power in the world. When it comes to the area in which you work, what can be the contribution that China can make?
But as Secretary General Xi Jinping emphasized very clear, China is still developing country. Yes, China is the largest developing country in the world. Also, second economy in the world. We know we must do our effort to promote economic development. This is firstly for Chinese interest and the benefit for Chinese people's living standard improvement. But also, China as 1.3 billion people and large economy with a very, very close trade relation with other countries. China's development, particularly China's sustainable development, certainly contribute to the global economy. This win-win situation.
It is only natural that those that are still in power, quote unquote, is reluctant to leave, or at least to leave some space for the others to catch up. And therefore, can China put its own expectation or put its own hope with the actions taken from others?
So that's why CPC Secretary General Xi Jinping emphasized very, very clear. We want to develop this new model of country relations. We want this peaceful change. So that's our wish, and China really do this with very hard work. We also hope that other countries can have this good coordination. But very frankly, between China and US, and through economic dialogue, we had this very good policy coordination. This is one case to demonstrate US as the largest economy in the world for last 60 years, and with the new economic power developed, such as China, if we can peacefully deal, we can very good communication, we really can share the mutual benefit. We said many, many times, Pacific is so large, that's large enough to let China, US work together and benefit each other.
Well, thank you very much, Vice Minister Zhu. Thank you for being with us. Thank you so much.
Well, that was my colleague talking to China's Vice Finance Minister, Mr. Zhu Guangyao. It's now back to my colleague Zhou Yue and our studio guests. Well, Zhou Yue, as Mr. Zhu mentioned, that the two biggest economies in the world, China and the U.S., are so dependent on each other. However, they're also at odds with each other at times.
Yes, indeed.
But of course, we have to admit that a good trade relation between the two countries will benefit the entire world.
Well, despite the fact there are a lot of problems to iron out. Thank you, Mama, for your reporting. And now we come to our studio discussion, and joining me here in the studio are Dr. Edward Xie, Chairman for Greater China and Senior Partner at global consultancy firm Booz & Company. Welcome. And also Professor Kenneth Kim from Renmin University. Well, Premier Wen Jiabao has delivered his government work report last time as Premier. Is setting the goal, the blueprint for the country's economy, 7.5 of GDP growth. That's a quite modest target, 13-year low. So is this kind of a slowdown of choice or necessity? Edward?
I think it's partly by choice and also partly by necessity. In the past, when we talk about very rapid growth of China at 9 to 10% growth, it was of a much smaller base. And today, China is the world's second largest economy in the world. And a reduction or correction of the growth rate is actually very natural from the standpoint of arriving at a more sustainable way of growing, achieving a higher quality growth for China.
Ken?
I agree. I think I was a little bit worried at first when the new government came in, because I thought, maybe they wanted to start off with a bang and, show some exuberance and some excitement, and they were going to go for the 8% predicted growth, or the goal of 8%.
Because
but
that's
I'm glad
a
they did
guarantee
it.
for employment for this
Exactly.
large country.
But I'm glad that they didn't. I'm glad they went with the 7.5. 7.5 is doable, and it's the growth that they're trying to go for is quality growth rather than just expansion. In the past, it's always been about let's expand as quickly as possible and as much as possible. But I'm glad this time that's not that. Can China achieve 8% growth? I definitely think that they can. Actually, I would say that most experts think that China can achieve at least 8% growth. But I'm glad that the government didn't put this kind of pressure on its businesses, on its people to try to achieve this, because I think right now, given that the rest of the world economy is climbing out of a recession, I think 7.5 is
So
quite
speed
doable.
is not a challenge for the Chinese economy. What is the challenge for China? Is it quality, structure, momentum? What is lying ahead that could be risky?
So right now, China's trying to shift some of its emphasis on growth from being an export primary country to doing some more domestic consumption. The domestic consumption is already occurring, and that's going to automatically occur because as the population of this country gets wealthier, that's going to occur. But I think what needs to be done to assure that domestic consumption continues to sustain the growth of the economy is that we need to do something about the income disparity, and that is very severe right now in China. And people talk about how they're going to try to solve this, but I don't really hear a lot of solutions. I mean, how are you going to do this? Are you going to increase minimum wages? Are you going to subsidize the poor, families? Are you going to, do some other kinds of things like this? I mean, these are all short-term solutions. I think part of the solution can be urbanization. And in fact, it's kind of odd to me that you rarely hear urbanization as being part of the solution for this income disparity. But definitely, it's very much the solution. But that brings up the other issue: how are you going to achieve urbanization? I mean, you've got people coming from the rural countries into the cities in China all the time.
Well,
but what they do is they save up some money and then they return.
Of course, it's a daunting challenge for China to become more urbanized. But can China become a consumption-driven economy like America is right now, down the road?
Yeah, I think for that to happen, a couple of things have to happen, right? One is that people have to feel much more secure, so that they are willing to extract the savings or spend the income.
A stronger social safety net.
Stronger safety net certainly is one of the things. Second is that there has to be some mechanisms to increase the disposable income of the Chinese people. And I think there's a lot of discussion right now about to what extent it is possible to reduce taxes for the Chinese consumers, whether or not this is the right time to do so. And I believe this is clearly a mechanism that the Chinese government should carefully investigate.
So do you guys agree which is the best way to raise the income, disposable income for the families? Is it to raise taxes on the businesses, or is it reduce taxes for those households? What is the best way?
I think the reduction, I agree with my colleague here, the reduction of taxes, it has to be approached very cautiously. And so, right now we're hearing that this is on the agenda to reduce taxes. But, you also have this, at the same time, if you're going to reduce taxes and also privatize some of the state-owned enterprises, then where's the money going to come from for the government to finance its activities? I mean, the government in China is very active in implementing many of its policies. So I think the reduction of taxes, you have to approach that with caution.
Actually, a lot of policies must be implemented with caution here in China. You're now watching Voices and Votes, our special coverage on the two sessions coming up next. How exactly does the world see China's emergence as a global economic power?
Deputies of the MPC are chosen nationwide and must go through two kinds of elections. The first is the popular vote, which elects deputies at the county and township level. Candidates who get more than half the votes are elected. However, what's called an indirect vote is used to elect deputies who hope to rise to the municipal, provincial, or national level. Candidates here are elected if they get more than half of the votes from members of the lower level People's Congress. If the number of candidates who get more than half the votes exceeds a designated number, those with the most votes are elected. According to China's constitution, deputies elected from provinces, autonomous regions, municipalities directly under the central government, special administrative regions, and the army may be chosen for the MPC.
And news. We cover a broad range of issues on the changing China during the annual political season in Beijing starting March the 3rd. Laws and policies are deliberated freely at the plenum of the MPC and CPPCC. Real representation from across the Chinese social spectrum. You can't miss it here only on Voices and Votes. A new era for China, a new leadership and new policy that will impact a quarter of the world population. Our reporters will bring you the latest as China faces the political, economic and diplomatic challenges that will help shape a generation. That is political season in 2013 with Han Bing, Ai Yang, Hou Na, Guan Xing and Zhang Lili. Only on CCTV News. Senior reporter back at the annual MPC and CPPCC sessions. Sharp questions. Headline-grabbing answers. China at a new era.
You're now watching Voices and Votes. One of the biggest changes in the past decade has been China's emergence as a global economic power. In the face of financial crises, China is making efforts to sustain its momentum and contribute to global stability. Our reporter Guan Xin takes a look at the impact of China's growing economic power.
China's GDP grew at an average annual rate of 9.3% in the past 5 years and became the second largest economy in the world. Dr. Zhu Haibing worked as a senior economist for the Bank for International Settlements for 10 years and came back to China last year to head the China Economic Research Team at JP Morgan.
The biggest event in the global economy in the last few years. So China has now surpassed Japan to be the second biggest economy. And markets wide expected that in 10-15 years, China will also surpass US, probably become the biggest economy in the world. At this stage, on the one hand, that the global economy will come if China's economy continue to perform very strongly, because that will be, of course, a positive push for the economic growth. On the other hand, they are concerned that China is now getting bigger and bigger, and of course, this in the global economy there's a competition across different economies, so there's a mixed feeling always.
Achieving the targeted growth rate is not an easy task. The global economic slowdown dragged down external demand and put a dent in China's export sector.
Right now, there's a lot of concern about the China economy, whether China will have a soft landing or hard landing. That's basically because that China is right now the biggest growth engine for the global economy. Last year, based on calculation, China contributed more than 40% to the global GDP growth. In many markets, for example, the global commodity market, China's demand right now represents about 50% in many different items.
To cope with external headwinds, China strives to stimulate internal growth momentum. Its vast consumption market is considered as a key for future growth. This also benefited many global investors here. Meanwhile, China's outbound investment is also growing at a rapid pace, helping create productivity and employment in other countries.
The Chinese government also has looked at some of the investments in Europe, has via the International Monetary Fund has participated in the financial stability funds for Europe indirectly. Everybody understands that it is in the benefit of all.
China is becoming more influential, more consequential. The country is now undertaking further reforms for long-term sustainable growth and is contributing to world economic stability. Guanxin, CCTV, Beijing.
Well, there are a lot of terms describing Chinese growth, the Chinese miracle, the economic wonder of the modern world. Well, these are just some of the terms that have been used to describe China's economic rise over the past decades. Well, some are even saying we are now on the verge of Asian century, with China leading the way. But just how has China's economic status changed in relation to the rest of the world over the past few years? My colleague Wu Haojun joins us now in the studio to tackle that. Good evening, Haojun.
Good evening.
Well, the world's second largest economy, the largest exporter, largest energy producer, well, these are just a few of the titles China now have. But going beyond that, tell us more about what exactly China's contribution to the global growth, especially over the past 5 years.
Well, Zoya, as far as the economy is concerned, China really deserves a Player of the Decade award, if you will. We already know all about the big numbers, so what I'm going to do here is highlight the changes and progress in China's contribution to the global economy. In the past 5 years, the total value of China's foreign trade has increased on average 12.2% annually. Well, this number isn't particularly impressive when you look at the kind of numbers China put up in the years prior. You have to look at the global economic climate in which this was achieved. For one, the economy of the 17-member Eurozone contracted for 3 consecutive quarters towards the end of 2012. In the meantime, China is becoming a more well-rounded player in the field of global trade. The country essentially spending more abroad. In 2008, China's total imports topped $1 trillion for the first time, and imports are now close to 5 times what they were a decade ago. Just to illustrate to you how this has contributed to growth across the globe, let's look at South Korea first. Its exports to China amounted to just 3.5% of GDP in 2000. By 2012, 12% of Seoul's GDP came from its exports to Beijing. And turning to Africa here, 11% of the continent's exports now go to China. So while China is no white knight in shining armor, its continued growth and participation in international trade may at least help get the world's struggling economies back on their feet. So yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Haojun, for your explanation. And it's time now for our global debate. Joining us live is Professor Yoritsumi Watanabe from Keio University in Japan, who is also the former Deputy General of the Japanese Foreign Ministry's Economic Affairs Bureau. And we also have Mr. Joseph Yenning from the German Council of Foreign Relations and Mr. James Shikwati, Director of the Inter-Regional Economic Network. Let me start with Professor Watanabe. Well, the past 5 years saw China's GDP grow at an average annual rate of 9.3%. China has surpassed Japan as the world's second largest economy. Even some people say, well, the Japanese sense of loss and being passed over is actually behind the territorial dispute between the two neighbors. What actually are the Japanese thinking? Is China's rise an opportunity and threat for Japan?
Well, certainly China's rise is not really a threat. I would say it's rather opportunity. And Japan's economy is very deeply involved in China's development. And I think more than 1/3 of China's total export to the world market are those products made by Japanese companies who invested heavily and extensively in China. So I think the Japanese economy and Chinese economy are two economies very complementary to each other. So the rise of China is a good thing essentially for Japanese economy too. So I don't see it's a threat. It's rather an opportunity. Of course, we have to face with certain challenges, but the challenges I think we can certainly overcome with the close cooperation and closer economic partnership.
You don't believe that the territorial disputes were in the way for the economic relations between the two neighbors?
Well, you see, the territorial issues, the issues, traditional sort of issue of international politics. But we have to look ahead, farther ahead of what lies in the future of our bilateral relations between Japan and China. And if we look at the future perspective, we have enormous opportunities if we even more closely cooperate in the field of economic matters. So I think the division of labor that we are engaged in both in Japan and in China are very complementary, as I said before. And I think we have to really develop that kind of cooperative relationship rather than conflictual relationship.
Okay, you're an optimist. Thank you, Mr. Watanabe. Now let's go to Europe. Mr. Jennings, there's much concern here in China that the European debt crises that will probably linger for quite some time will hurt trade between Europe and China. The Chinese government appears confident that Europe will resolve the crisis on its own. Will China doing all it can is just wait out? So what can China do to help?
Well, first of all, there is not that much in the current situation that China could do. After all, at the root of the crisis is a lack of structural reform and a lack of good governance in a number of EU member states. This is not something that you can actively support significantly from the outside. China is engaged, however, through the IMF. China is engaging more through foreign direct investments, and I expect them to grow on. China would play a significantly stronger role if the European integration was advanced to a state where, for example, Eurobonds would be issued, and then China could be investing into state bonds from Europe and not just representing Europe's weak nations. So that would be an opportunity for China to engage much more. But China should not engage in all of this for political reasons, but for sound economic reasons. I think it is a sound business proposition for China to look towards Europe as a market.
Mr. Jennings?
Yeah, it should make economic sense for China to engage.
All right. And there is another thing that we've been talking about here in China. That's the consumption that covers only half of the GDP in China, much lower than the global average, 70%. China is now to unleash that potential of domestic demand. But the problem is, what does that mean to the rest of the world? This question goes to Mr. Shikwati. If China want to turn inward, will that have an impact on the world?
Yeah, China's consumption pattern is already impacting on Africa, as we've already seen in terms of the speculation on land, as the Chinese look for more space to produce food, and already it is also putting pressure on African governments to review their policies in order to, formulate what you may call maybe a win-win situation, so that we don't have a scenario where the quest for food leads to land grabs, which can eventually lead to political upheavals.
Professor Watanabe, what do you think if China turned inward and more rely on its own consumption rather than export?
Well, I think the world economy can be characterized by lack of equilibrium, the balance overall. And I think the East Asia is producing much of trade surplus vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So that means that East Asia in its totality, not only China but also Japan and Korea to a certain extent, we have to increase our domestic consumption. I think Japan, for instance, has
But China is a larger market than Japan, you have to admit.
Yeah, indeed. So altogether, I mean, the East Asian countries like Japan, China, Korea, I think we have to increase our domestic demand. And that's a way to reduce the disequilibrium of the world economy. And that certainly contributes to the stable and sustainability of the world economy.
Mr. Jenin, the change of growth model here in China should sound like good news to Europeans because they want to sell stuff here.
Oh, that's definitely good news. The more economic development in China reaches out from the coastal regions or from the high growth regions into the country, the better for Europe. I think Europe is really eager to supply tools, machinery, and all sorts of industrial products, but also high-quality consumer goods to China. And in that sense, many Europeans see their opportunity, particularly in the Chinese market, as a very complementary one. The Chinese market today is probably more open to many European products than the Japanese market is, and that's a good news for Europe.
Well, Professor Watanabe, China is now looking to accelerate the development of trade and services also, and further improve the structure of its investment elsewhere in the world. How will Japan and also the rest of Asia take that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the Japanese market is certainly more open than the Chinese market in respect of European products. For instance, European cars' share in Japanese market is above 5.9%. Whereas Japanese cars being imported into Europe is about 3.7%. So actually, European cars are enjoying their larger market here in Japan. And obviously, with other luxurious products that Japan has been importing, indicates that Japan is very open market for European products. That's the kind of comment that I want to address to our friend from Berlin.
And also, according to some projections, China will surpass the U.S. sometime in 2030 as the world's largest economy. What do you think will happen before that happened? China join in reform of the international system, or just should China follow the rules but write the rules? Japan was at that threshold about 10, 15 years ago.
But I think, you know, that China is certainly requested to play its important role commensurate to its economic wealth. And now the China is growing past 5 years, annual rate of over 9.3%, and from now on around 7.5%. Okay, so perhaps by year 2030, China's GDP will become bigger than that of United States. Okay, so if that is a fact, then we would like to see the China to be involved in the reform of international economic system. But first, I think China should integrated into the existing international systems such as WTO, the World Trade Organization, and they have to honor what they have previously committed when they joined the WTO back in year 2001. So China should become what we call the responsible stakeholder for all areas, issues like trade, finance, and also environment protection and so forth.
But the problem is China is already integrated with the world. It is asked to take on more responsibilities. That probably means China will rewrite some of the rules to suit its own interests. Mr. Jenin, should China rewrite the rules of some of the institutions? And in what way?
I believe so. I think only idealists believe that the future is just China signing up to everything that's already existing. I think it comes with economic impact, with economic weight, and with size, that China will seek to engage in developing the rules of international trade and finance across the board, that also reflects the interests and needs of China. I think that is normal. And all other actors are adjusting to that fact and are gradually getting prepared. Because it will also mean that when China engages in developing the rules, it will also commit itself much deeper than it is now, where it is basically signing up to pre-existing schemes.
And this question goes to Mr. James Shikwati. What do you think of the promise of China's presence in Africa? There are problems, of course, but there are also good signs that China may be investing more and joining hands with African partners.
Yeah, first of all, from the international systems perspective, Africa has found itself being forced to measure development in terms of how much it consumes products from Western countries and of recent China. So I think in terms of reviewing the international system, I think we are faced with a situation where we have a system that is skewed towards mostly the West, which forces Africa to export raw materials instead of producing finished products. So one would wish that maybe China's rise would lead to the review of these systems. But of course, so far as we speak, I think China seems to be just joining the game to continue with the system as it is. So that's a big challenge from the African perspective.
And we still have to play that game. Thank you very much, Mr. James Shikwati and Mr. Joseph Jennings, also Professor Watanabe, for your perspectives. Let's come back to our studio discussions. Well, different places have different sense about China's economy. But in general, what does the world think about China's economic performance? Are they happy with what China has been doing?
I think over the last decade or even more than a decade, 2 decades or so, the world has admired China's economic achievement. I think to a lot of people in the world, the economic achievement of China was unimaginable. The fact that China was able to make so much progress within such a period of time, from nowhere to become now the world's second largest economy, it was almost unthinkable 20 years ago, but China has done it.
But there is every coin has two sides. Many people still have their complaints.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there is admiration, but I would say that admiration takes a back seat to envy and some bitterness. There are other countries that are trying to compete with China, and they feel like maybe because China has been accused of having an undervalued currency, that it's been playing unfairly in the global markets. And so I think, there is admiration, that's for sure, but I think the primary sentiment that you're getting all over the world is some of envy and some of bitterness.
And come back to China's economy itself. Over the past 30 years, China has shifted from a planned economy to a market-based economy, and also achieved a GDP growth around 10% for 2 decades, and lifted 600 million people out of poverty. All these achievements, all these accomplishments, do you think have delivered a better life for most of the people in China? Are people satisfied with China's economic growth? Has it paid off?
Well, certainly from the increase of the living standard standpoint, I say most, if not all, the Chinese have benefited from this economic growth in the last 2 decades. But clearly, in the process, there's a lot of other undesirable elements that has been brought into the Chinese society. Things such as corruption, things such as environmental issues, things such as income disparity, and so on. So on one hand, it has really helped a lot of the Chinese people. On the other hand, it has also created quite a lot of problems.
So all those costs marry the achievements we've made, Ken?
I think overall the vast majority of the people today are enjoying a better lifestyle than their parents were. You always hear stories about a time of struggle for the older generation, that they were trying to just working hard just to survive. And I think for the most part, people today are working hard so that they can enjoy life. And so definitely I think the standards of living have increased. I mean, there has been some cost, of course. I mean, for example, with industrialization, you're going to have pollution, for example, and the cities are getting crowded, for example. And so there is always going to be some cost. I mean, you can't make progress without suffering some costs, that's for sure.
But for the average Chinese, they see is that their water and air have become more polluted, and they have to pay higher price for their houses. They have a lot of complaints, and all those are just targeted at the government. So the government is under a lot of pressure. What do you think the government should do right now?
I think the key thing is, going back to an earlier point that I made, I think the key thing that government needs to do is to do something about the income disparity. I think and urbanization is part of that key issue. People are coming into the cities, and the government likes this, and the government wants to urbanize. But how do you keep the people from not leaving? How do you get the people to commit? I mean, they come into the cities because why? Because they know that there's better health care here, there's better access, better transportation, better education, better housing, but they can't get those things. And so the government needs to figure out, how are they going to facilitate this process so that the people that are coming in from the rural areas can contribute to the, expanding size of the cities, because that's part of the urbanization process.
But some of the existing institutions are not helpful for the urbanization process, like the household registration system, like healthcare division between the rural and urban areas. Those things are not easy to tackle.
But I believe that's where the Chinese government really have to seriously look into some degree of reform, is to what extent this hukou system should be changed in order to continue to drive urbanization and also making China a more modern and more civil society.
You think the government can take on the challenge like this?
Oh, I hope so. I mean, we've, my wife has been trying to get a hukou because she's in Shanghai. She's been trying to get a hukou for more than a year, and the red tape that's involved and the proof that's required is just, it seems never ending, and she still hasn't been able to achieve that. And so it's, I think that would be great if we can do something about deregulating that process, and because after all, this is also part of China's, objectives as well.
The incentive is obviously there. What is in the way of doing massive deregulation of those old bureaucracies?
I think part of it is, and that's one of the things, when I first moved to China, I was in awe of the amount of bureaucracy that exists. And so, and I wondered why this is, and I don't really quite have an answer to this yet, but I think part of it is that, it's as China is rapidly transitioning, if you don't have a lot of levels of bureaucracy, then things can get out of hand and go crazy. I mean, let's look at the case of Russia, for example. I mean, Russia could be in a situation where China is in today, but because of their lack of regulations and the lack of bureaucracy, you have this country that's hasn't been able to achieve its promise at one point, but China has, and so bureaucracy might be a necessary evil for now.
But it seems at the top, at least, they have the political will to move on and to have an overhaul of the system. What kind of roadmap they need to put out there? What kind of policies they should put on the table?
Well, there's certainly a lot of policies that the Chinese government will really need to put on the table to actually rectify the overall situation on the Chinese economy, as well as just the overall sort of social conditions of China. Well, I could think of a couple of policy areas that are very important, in addition to the hukou reform that we talk about. One is, I believe that there has to be some change in the one-child policy, as the overall population of China is becoming more aging, that we are losing the so-called demographic sort of dividend. So I believe that is the process or policy that needs to be looked at. I believe that innovation is going to become more important as China continues to move forward. And so in order to support innovation, the policy or the regulation on intellectual property rights protection has to be improved in order to support innovation.
And that's an area where we could use some more bureaucracy, in fact, because the Chinese rules and regulations right now doesn't provide an environment where innovation can take place, because intellectual property rights are I wouldn't say very weak, but they are somewhat weak here. And so if you want a situation where innovation can take place, I'd like to see more bureaucracy there.
I want to pin you down on changing demography here, because China is aging, as you said. China has been said that we have a population bonus because we have a large population. The provision of labor force is just abundant. But will that change at any moment down the road, and will that be a big problem?
I think it's becoming a problem, as we said, the population is aging, Aging is a gradual process. It doesn't happen overnight. But at the same time, if you don't arrest that, it's going to create some problem for us down the road.
And Ken, what do
I
you
agree. Think? I think as my co-guest has mentioned, the one-child policy that's a good area that China could look into. With the aging population and with a lot of the children right now going overseas and staying overseas. It really limits families' abilities to, be looked after by perhaps a second child and so forth. And so I don't think China has to worry about, overpopulation at this point because, because so many people are going overseas right now.
Right. Well, the impact of the embassy and the decisions made at Beijing will have a great influence on China's future. And coming up next, we'll have more talks on that. But now, let's turn to China's leadership transition's effect being felt across the borders. Africa has established strong economic and political ties with China. And for a look at what lies ahead for China's relationship with that region, let's go now to my colleague, Terry-Ann Chebet, at the CCTV studio in Nairobi. And
So thank you very much and good evening. And now some more perspectives on the growing economic cooperations between China and Africa. At the 2012 Davos meeting of global business leaders, it was said that China and Africa will be at the center of world trade. Now more than 2,000 Chinese companies have established business in Africa. Now that's according to figures from 2011. Trade between China and Africa stood at 491.22 million. That's in 2003. But in 2004, the total volume of Sino-African trade amounted to $29.47 billion US dollars. Now in 2011, China's trade with Africa hit 166.3 billion. That's a jump of 83% over 2009. Now, figures from 2012, it was projected to hit 220 billion. That's up 25% from 2011. So what are the terms of this engagement? China imports a range of products from Africa, including crude oil, diamonds, refined petroleum, refined natural gas, while on the other side of the coin, Africa imports mechanical and electric products, machinery, construction material, among others. Now, Standard Chartered economist Razia Khan says the biggest challenges facing Africa's trade relations was the current account deficit growing on the African side. Now, of course, this is mainly due to the rapid growth of imports from China, but also the continent's weaker historical growth compared with China. African governments are now being asked to look at how partnerships with China can further link its economies to global supply chains, and also to explore whether there is scope for Africa itself to develop its manufacturing sector, as well as to respond to China with a multilateral agenda. Now, Africa is positioning itself to benefit from strengthened bilateral ties with China. The change of guard in China's leadership, it is hoped, will usher in closer cooperation and more economic partnerships.
For Africa, the significance of the change of guard in China cannot be naysayed. As international focus shifts to China in the coming week, Africa will be keenly watching as China's new top leadership takes office. This follows last year's successful 18th CPC National Congress, in which a new generation of top Chinese leaders, led by Xi Jinping, were elected in one of the world's most important transitions of power. But it is unlikely that this change of guard will herald a radical shift in China's political and economic policies towards Africa. Still, on the lips of many African leaders is the question, what exactly lies ahead? In establishing ties with African countries, China pursues a policy of mutual benefit and non-interference in the domestic affairs of individual states.
The support of China is an innovative one in forms of there is no tied conditions on it, so it is a friendly support, and we do appreciate it.
This hasn't gone down well with the United States and its European allies. China's economic ties with Africa, including its rapidly rising trade and investment in the region, have drawn global attention. For its part, the West has actively embraced a policy of sanctions and conditions before such aid can be given.
The days of having outsiders come and extract the wealth of Africa for themselves, leaving nothing or very little behind, should be over in the 21st century.
Regardless, however, China has substantially increased its economic engagement with sub-Saharan African countries, with strong growth in both imports and exports. Trade between China and Africa has increased more than sixfold during the past decade to $120 billion in 2011, according to the African Development Bank. China is currently Africa's largest trading partner. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation was established in October 2000 as an official forum to strengthen this relationship.
Where we have to cooperate in international fora in the multilateral issues like the UN reform, climate change, terrorism, fighting terrorism and piracy issue. All these global issues, we have to cooperate Africa, China.
Uganda's Foreign Minister Sam Kutesa told journalists on the sidelines of last September's FOCAC meeting, quote, "Trade is not yet balanced, but we hope we can work towards balancing it. The signs are extremely good after the FOCAC meetings, where China has now allowed up to 95% non-tariff barrier-free goods. We think this is a great opening between Uganda, Africa and China." End of quote.
We are going to work very well together. We are going to work in a way that will mutually benefit both Africa and China. China would benefit from having trade with us because they are buying things that they need. We will benefit from trade generally.
China's infrastructure footprint in Africa is epitomized by ultra-modern roads in the newly built African Union headquarters in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. Inaugurated last year, the entire $200 million project was funded by China as a gift to the African Union. And as China ushers into office its new leaders, Africa can only hope that these new mutual ties will continue.
Well, and that's just a few reasons why Africa is watching China's new leadership and the significance of that to the growing economic relations between the two partners. Well, that's it from us here in Nairobi. Back to you, Zoyue, in Beijing.
All right, thank you very much, Terry-Ann. That's our reporter Terry-Ann Chibet reporting from our Nairobi studio. And now go to my colleague Wang Mangmang again, who's been tracking some of the reactions from the internet about the two sessions. Mangmang, what can you tell us?
Well, Zoya, as China wants to continue its economic miracle and to keep at it, it has to look at its different model of development and rethink its economic structure. So CCTV News has been running a number of online surveys in the run-up to the two sessions. In the latest, we gathered opinions of what people see as the major driving force behind today's Chinese economy. It turns out more and more people believe China's economic growth now relies less on imports and exports and more on growing domestic consumption. Now, here's this pie chart. According to our online survey, 67% of people believe consumption will contribute most to China's growth, and 17% still think investment remains the strongest force driving China's economic development, and 16% say foreign trade is still powering the nation's rapid development. All right, now coming up next, with foreign demand still sluggish, can China's export find a way to stay competitive?
Welcome back. China has set its target for foreign trade growth at around 8% for the year 2013. This comes amid weaker export demand and increasing bilateral issues in overseas markets almost everywhere. Experts say foreign demand for China's exports is likely to remain lackluster and that China needs to transform from being a large exporter to a competitive exporter. Attendees at the ongoing MPC sessions underway in Beijing this week had this today to our reporter Ying Hang. Some of the changes absolutely need to be made for that transition to happen.
China's foreign trade growth target is higher than last year's real growth of 7.5%, but still below the 10% target set for 2012. Experts say China's export growth is to remain weak as demand from major economies such as EU and US have not yet recovered.
I think the export market remains quite challenging. Back in 2012, China's net trade or net exports didn't really contribute to GDP growth. In fact, it was a negative contribution. Going forward in 2013, we also don't expect Chinese export to rebound substantially, given the external environment is still quite subdued.
But figures in the first month of 2013 provided a glimpse of hope for the recovery of China's foreign trade as exports grew 25% from a year earlier, imports surged 28.8% from a year earlier. That results $29.2 billion of trade surplus that topped market expectation of $22 billion. After 7 straight quarters of slowdown, China's economy picked up in the fourth quarter of last year. Despite the higher-than-expected export number shows that the major economies, such as US and EU, are recovering, but lots of deputies are worrying that China's export market ought to remain sluggish.
I believe with the current situation, domestic consumption will still be the major driver for China's economic growth.
Besides shrinking demand, China's exporters, most of them small and private firms, will face other hurdles. First, the rising yuan against the US dollar is gradually trimming the profits of China's exporters. And then there's the resurgence of trade protectionism and other barriers. These are discouraging problems for Chinese wanting to do business overseas. But as one attendee at this week's MPC session says, innovation could be the key.
China has unveiled lots of policies to support export enterprises development since the start of the 18th Communist Party of China sessions. And we are expecting more policies to be rolled out, encouraging the innovation and brand building of enterprises.
We are pushing the government to unveil policies to encourage or require banks to lend a certain amount of capital to small and private firms so their financing needs can be met.
Meanwhile, China's Ministry of Commerce is also vigorously pushing the improvement of China's trade structure. Policymakers are encouraging more and more China's high-tech companies to step outside while increasing China's import volume. Yanhang, CCTV, Beijing.
So what are people talking about? How China can stay competitive? Where is China's strong suit for that? Let's turn to my colleague Wang Meng once again. Wang Meng.
Well, Zoya, China is now doing business with the rest of the world. Some are successful, but others are not. And China still faces a lot of trade disputes with its partners. While China's web users have different thoughts about China's advantages and disadvantages in international trade. And from our online survey, we gathered their concerns and expectations. So now let's look at some of them. Netizen Yong Levin says China is indeed a strong exporting nation, but most of its trade is medium and low-end products. So its high-end products are still unable to compete with that of developed countries. China should therefore aim for higher trade development. Well, this is a great opportunity. And another netizen says, I am very proud to see goods made in China in foreign countries and to see China's productivity influence abroad. However, China should lay emphasis on domestic demand for future development, and this draws benefits from the 1.3 billion population and also lessens the impact from political disputes and the global economic crisis. Well, so yeah, indeed, trade is not a zero-sum game. So by respecting each other country's core value, I think it would eventually benefit the whole world.
Actually, that brand made in China has changed the tone a little bit. People are kind of expecting more created in China, modeled in China, or even marketed in China.
Like when we talk about made in China, it's about the lower-end products, but made by China, there are core technologies involved.
Well, it may be a long process to move up the ladder of value. Thank you very much, Mamang, for your reporting. Let's come back to our studio discussion, and joining me here in the studio are Professor Kenneth Kim from Renmin University, and also Mr. Cao Can, a columnist at Economic Observer, one of China's top 3 economic-focused newspapers. Well, welcome, Cao Can. Let's talk about the China's economic performance that is being appreciated by the rest of the world. Recent data from General Administration of Customs shows China's trade in goods and services in 2012 was $3.87 trillion. We don't know when exactly China will overpass the U.S. to become the largest economy in the world. But people are now kind of complaining. While China has been enjoying a free ride of the global trade system, China has been practicing mercantilism, deliberately devaluing its own currency to bring more money back home. What do you think?
Well, I think, this assumption that China benefits from the world economy while the rest of the world just suffers because of the Chinese prosperity.
You benefit more than the rest of them.
Well, I don't think so, because China has been flooding the world with cheap consumer goods. Consumers all around the world benefit from these cheap imports. Not only that, China has been lending savings to all the major countries. China has been buying a lot of U.S. Treasury bonds, European debt, right, to help them solve their financial crisis. On the other hand, these Western countries, they have been consuming beyond their means. They're consuming products made by Chinese, and they actually borrow the money from the Chinese citizens to buy Chinese products. So this is basically vendor financing. Back in 2010, at the height of the financial crisis, the euro was in danger of collapsing. The yield on the Portugal debt, Greek debt, went through the roof. At that point, Premier Wen Jiabao made the strategic decision to intervene in the bond market, bought a lot of European debt, and then situation stabilized. Now you see the euro and the dollar exchange rate is about 134.
It seems that you're saying China is a savior of the world economy.
That's basically what I'm saying. But China has also benefited from the international trade system. China has learned its technology from the West, the management skills. So I think it's a win-win situation. But China has done its share of helping the world economy.
Has China been playing the game fairly?
Okay, so I have to disagree. So the resentment that you're getting from the rest of the world toward China. The reason is that while the rest of the world is in a crisis or in an economically unfortunate situation, China is coming to provide cheap products with an artificially undervalued currency, and so it's taking advantage of the situation in the global markets, and that's how the world sees this.
But you see, is it
a fair assessment? The problem is.
But you see, undervaluing the Chinese RMB actually benefits
I think
American consumers.
All experts outside of China will agree that China's currency is undervalued. You look at these studies by the IMF and the World Bank. And
I don't disagree with you that Chinese RMB is undervalued. What I disagree with who benefits from undervalued RMB.
Has been saying that the value system has to be a long process.
You're saying that the Chinese is not benefiting from
No, I'm saying that the American consumers benefit from undervalued currency, because without undervalued currency, the American consumers would be deprived of these cheap consumer goods. And the way China undervalues currency is by purchasing a lot of dollars and the treasury bonds. If China stopped buying it, the interest rate in the U.S. would go through the roof.
No.
He said this kind of a momentum has to be there to ensure that we both enjoy the benefits.
Right. No, the U.S. businesses cannot compete with Chinese businesses because of the undervalued currency.
But you see, the American business cannot compete with German business. The American business cannot compete with Japanese business. If you look at the situation of GM
but you can't compare. Germany is not exporting cheap products.
Well, let me finish. The euro. The U.S. has never accused the European Central Bank of devaluing and undervaluing its currency, right? But
because it never has.
But you look at the competitiveness of the auto industry. The GM was on the verge of bankruptcy. It would have already bankrupted without a bailout from the federal government. But the German auto industry is doing much better than the American auto industry. The same situation for the Japanese auto industry. So you can't really just complain China.
And can you have to admit some of the industries that will never come back to the U.S. It's not because you have a higher value of dollars.
And don't get me wrong. I think it's fine that China is undervaluing the currency.
But how does China undervalue its currency? China undervalues its currency by printing a lot of Chinese RMB to buy U.S. dollars. That's how they maintain the pact.
Correct.
And also here in China, people are arguing that the U.S. is undervaluing its currency by printing more money, quantitative easy.
If China can maintain its undervalued currency, I think that's great. I don't think China needs to revalue their currency just because the rest of the world is angry. If this is something that China can maintain, I'm all in favor of it. I think it's great that China can do it. This is being done despite inflation in China. This is being done despite high labor costs in China.
We actually import this inflation from the U.S. because when we pack the Chinese RMB to dollar, we basically import the monetary policy from the Federal Reserve.
Let's talk about the quality of the trade. Now, people saying that China is a big trading partner, is a big trading country. but people don't say China is a strong trading partner. So it seems there's a quality problem here.
Well, I don't think so,
because you're always at the low end.
No, that's no longer the case.
The value system.
I think that perception is kind of outdated, because if you look at what China has been producing recently, if you look at companies like Haier, Lenovo, their products are getting a lot of market share in America and all the developed countries. If you look at China's lead in some high-tech industries like clean energy, China's products like in PV industry, clean tech. Actually, American government.
But those are still in the lower end,
right?
But we are moving up the value chain. It takes time, but we're moving up the value chain. It's not just the case that China is producing these socks and toys. That's what used to be the case.
That's still a large bulk of it.
That's a large bulk of that. That's the case. But China has been opening up for only 30 years. It takes some time for China to move up the value chain, and I think that's what the Chinese, a lot of Chinese companies are trying to accomplish. That's why a lot of Chinese companies are going abroad to acquire some foreign companies. Why do they do that?
But you don't believe there's room for improvement for China's foreign trade?
I believe there's a lot of room.
In what area?
For instance, China can learn to, like you just suggested, move up the value chain. Maybe getting into the auto industry, right? Chinese auto companies are still weak, not very competitive, unlike the South Korean counterparts and Japanese counterparts. So there's a lot of room to improve. For instance, the Chinese auto industry can go abroad and acquire some, sound auto companies, and because of this synergy, China can acquire the technology. That's why we call.
Ken, what is your advice?
I think the exports that are being exported, I agree that the quality is improving, but I also agree that it's not improving as fast as it could, and so there needs to be some changes to the infrastructure. And one area in particular is China needs to figure out how to encourage innovation. China is very good at making quality products. I mean, they do it for a lot of U.S. firms and for a lot of Western European firms. So they're very good at making quality products, but they don't do it for themselves. Why not? I think it's because they just don't have the incentive to innovate. I think there needs to be more to be done with regard to strengthening the rules and regulations to protect intellectual property rights in China.
It takes time, right? If you look at the Japanese example, when Japan first opened up, their products are mostly low end. They produce a lot of toys, stuff that are easy to make. But eventually,
it takes time. It maybe also take efforts.
Yeah, take efforts. Definitely. I mean, innovation is important.
We're talking about what kind of efforts.
Right, and that's why I think the Chinese government actually put a lot of emphasis on research and development, encourage a lot of universities to do more research in those areas. So we are moving in that direction. It takes time. So, but I'm very optimistic that that goal will be accomplished in the future.
Oh, great. We can disagree. We can also agree to disagree. For more about what should look for in China's trade relationship with the United States, let's go to the United States. My colleague Philip Yin is now in Washington, D.C. for more discussions on that. Phil?
Thank you, Zhou Yu. Let's take a closer look at the trade frictions between the United States and China. Bilateral trade between the world's two largest national economies exploded in the last decade, reaching a record high $485 billion in 2012. This, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics. China is now the third largest export market for the United States and its second largest trading partner next to Canada. And last year, the United States overtook the European Union as the top destination for Chinese goods. The U.S. trade balance between China has remained negative, though, over the last decade, widening to $315 billion last year. This has created a lot of friction between the two countries. The United States accuses China of unfairly subsidizing its manufacturers and has slapped anti-dumping and anti-subsidy tariffs on a range of Chinese products, including solar panels, thermal paper, and even steel sinks. It has lodged 13 cases against China at the World Trade Organization, half the number of all WTO complaints against the Chinese government. But last year, China lodged its own complaints over the import duties on 22 Chinese exports worth $7.3 billion. China called it trade protectionism. In 2012, the lines between trade disputes and national security got blurry. A U.S. congressional probe recommended against allowing Chinese telecom equipment makers Huawei and ZTE to expand here in the United States. And President Barack Obama personally intervened to ban Chinese machinery maker Sany from developing a wind farm project in Oregon. But the two economies remain closely engaged, and trade experts here in the U.S. are closely watching the two sessions in Beijing for signs of how this relationship will develop further. Here's Daniel Wrenches with more.
As America's political leaders sparred for power in Washington last year, foreign policy debates often included a contest to sound tougher on China. Both candidates accused Beijing of currency manipulation and unfair trade practices. But as leadership transitions are finalized in both nations, trade experts predict a period of greater stability ahead. Policy analysts are especially interested in who will replace Vice Premier Wang Qishan, a key economic and trade leader and co-chair of the economic track of the US-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue.
Can we say anything about, do they have pro-reform tendencies? Do they seem interested in reforming the Chinese economy, opening up more to foreign investment? Emphasizing domestic consumption rather than exports, for instance. These are all things that U.S. stakeholders are really eager to see, the reforms that they really want China to enact.
Few expect major breakthroughs early on, but many will be watching for progress towards a possible bilateral investment treaty or BIT.
The major issue for the United States is market access into China, opening up investment sectors to U.S. companies, financial services and others. Well, China is still considering whether and how it wants to do that. Does it want to open its economy more? And until it makes those internal domestic decisions, political decisions, it's difficult to see the BIT really making much headway.
Moving forward, cybersecurity could become an even bigger issue than it already is, based on concerns expressed in both countries about the theft of intellectual property and data.
Intellectual property protection, though, the meaning of that term is also expanding to include things like the protection of trade secrets. And this gets into a whole other realm of U.S.-China relations that's extremely important and will be a big focus in 2013 as well.
The trade agenda will also be influenced by America's pursuit of regional trade agreements, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership and a new push for an EU-US deal. Overall, there is a desire here in Washington to improve trade, economic and investment ties with China as the two sides seek areas of mutual interest and navigate their differences. Daniel Wrenches, CCTV, Washington.
As you just heard, there's a lot at stake and a lot of folks around the world watching and waiting to see what Beijing will do next. Speaking of that, back to you in Beijing.
All right, thank you, Phil. And that's Philip In bringing their perspective about China-U.S. trade interactions from our D.C. studio. Let's come back to our studio discussions. Well, it seems both sides are complaining the other one is not opening the market enough. So this kind of trade disputes and frictions, is it just part of the game, or it will be detrimental to the bilateral trade relations?
It doesn't have to be part of the game. I mean, what you're seeing now is like this non-cooperation. And if you have non-cooperation, it's just going to hurt both parties. I think both parties need to realize, both China and the United States need to realize that they can both win in this situation. And so it doesn't have to be a game. It doesn't have to be where, there's only one size pie and that they're each trying to, go after a bigger slice of this. I think what they need to do is they just need to, figure out where they can both benefit in this trade agreement.
Well, I disagree with Professor King here, respectfully, because I think the major victim of these trade disputes will actually be American consumers. The Chinese consumers will benefit from a reduction in the exports to the U.S. because one of the major global imbalances that plague the world economy is that the Americans are consuming too much and saving too little, whereas the Chinese are consuming too little and saving too much, lending savings to the American consumers to buy Chinese products. So how do we adjust this global imbalance? Well, the Americans needs to reduce its consumption. That means reduce its imports from China.
America is planning to do that, export more products to China. They asked China to open more markets.
Right, but the key thing is what can they produce to export to Chinese? Because they actually run a trade deficit with almost every nation on the face of the earth. They run a trade deficit with Japan, right? They run a trade deficit with European countries. So it's not that the Chinese are not opening market to them.
So is it because America has become desperate?
I'm really surprised by this point of view. This because you're looking at the very bottom end of this. I'm not about trying to solve just these symptoms, which is what you're talking about. I mean, I'm looking at trying to solve this from the top down. And so what am I talking about here? I'm saying make U.S. businesses want to be competitive with Chinese businesses. And if U.S. businesses can be competitive with Chinese businesses, they're going to employ more people, and the people in the United States are going to become wealthier, and they won't have to rely on cheap products. Or do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
I mean,
but the key thing is here.
And so what you're talking about just giving more money to the Chinese businesses so that they can produce cheap products for U.S. consumers to buy. I mean, I really cannot believe that this is your point of view.
Well, my point of view is that who should be blamed for lack of competitiveness in the U.S.? The Americans are to blame because they run a trade deficit. How do you explain the fact that the U.S. runs a trade deficit with almost every single nation on the face of the earth? They run a trade deficit with Japan,
is America
with
losing
the Gulf states.
That's why Obama is pushing forward his double export program, but that's
they
so much headwind.
They fail to increase their exports. That's why the trade deficit is still about $500 billion.
There's no question that the U.S. consumes, and there's no question that the U.S. consumes to excess. And there's no question that the U.S. has brought this partially upon themselves. That there's no question. But you have a very overly simplistic view of this.
It's not always simplistic. It's based on facts, based on reality. How to explain the fact that despite the fact the dollar has been depreciating against the Chinese RMB since 2005, why does the trade deficit persist?
Okay, one by one, please.
No, I'm not disputing your facts. I'm disputing your opinion that the U.S. consumers are the ones who will lose if China becomes.
They will lose. They definitely will lose. If let's say if China stopped exporting to Americans, where do they get these cheap products? What's your answer?
Okay.
From where? But the United States. But we don't want to be a country where we have to buy cheap products. That's my whole point. And you're saying
if they don't, why do we have to keep buying the savings?
We have to leave it there. We have to change to another topic. That is, China is facing challenges from both destinations. On the other hand, China is trying to export more products to America. America is trying to have a reindustrialization, more robots manufacturing is going back shore. Another thing is that in Southeast Asia, there is cheaper labor there. China is also facing competition from the rest of Asia, less expensive labor there. So how can China handle challenges from two sides?
I think the most significant factor here is that China has been trying to cultivate new trading relationships with emerging nations. Because if you look at the member nations of a lot of ASEAN nations, Philippines, Indonesia, these nations have been growing much faster than the developed nations. So China has been doing more trade with developing countries to reduce its reliance on the Western world.
But those countries could be China's competitors too.
Right, but they can be competitive. But the thing is, when we do trade with emerging countries, we don't lend them the savings. They actually export useful, real products to the Chinese citizens in exchange for Chinese-made products. Unlike the U.S., the U.S. exported dollars, U.S. Treasury bonds, financial assets.
Only the United
Chinese
States
products.
market is large enough to take the quantities of products.
I understand, but we can increase domestic consumption.
That's the biggest market so far in the world.
We can increase domestic consumption, but most significant factor is that even though the U.S. consumer market is huge, they can't afford to buy Chinese products. If they export a fair amount of American products to Chinese so that the trade deficit would disappear, then fine. We're happy to trade. What we don't like is continue to buy U.S. Treasury bonds to lend the money to the American consumers to buy Chinese products. But that would prevent the financing.
That structure didn't happen artificially.
Right.
It is a thing that happened naturally.
And that's why the Chinese leadership has been talking about economic transformation, reducing its reliance on exports, and increase domestic consumption.
Actually, both United States and China want to turn around, want to change the fact that we are dependent on each other too much. Right. The matter is, in what way can we change the trend?
I want to go back to a point that you raised about, maybe fostering some relationships with the developing countries. Okay, so that's an interesting idea. But I mean, earlier you pointed out that China needs to turn the corner and start making quality products. And so, are you proposing that China has like a two-tier system of exporting both quality products and also continue to export cheap products to the developing countries?
Yeah. I do think that we don't have to choose one or the other. We can do both.
Okay.
Well, let's talk about trade further, but I have to show this story to you. In the face of the global economic stagnation, actually, and weak demand, many are now questioning whether China's trade figures can hold up in the tough economic climate all around the world. Last year, Chinese foreign trade increased 6% to $3.87 trillion, but that was much lower than the 10% target set by the government. Officials have cited economic problems in the EU, the US, and other major trading partners as the reason for the lower than expected figure. But when that figure was broken up a little, you find that emerging markets are gaining more weight in China's foreign trade. For example, ASEAN countries saw their share of Chinese foreign trade rise last year, with January showing 49% year-on-year growth, and China-ASEAN trade reaching a huge $36.99 billion. Well, that's what we've been talking about. China is turning its eyes elsewhere because Europe and the United States is still in trouble. We have to diversify our foreign trade structure. So is it a wise way of thinking about it?
Yes, and I think we need to accelerate this trend because the European consumers, American consumers will continue to suffer for as far as eyes can see because these currencies will continue to lose value. And if you look at the American case, the American government is running $1 trillion budget deficit for as far as eyes can see. They have to do huge substantive spending cuts. And that would, what would that translate into? That means the American consumers will suffer, and also the housing market is propped up by the federal.
So you have a very gloomy prediction about the U.S. economy.
But let's look at it this way. I mean, if you think that China can go into this two-tier system where they can also export quality products, you do realize that they are going to then compete with a whole new set of countries, for example. I mean, right now, I think we have pretty good relationships with Korea, and hopefully we can repair our trading relationships with Japan. And they're very important trading partners with China, right? But now, once we start making quality products, which Korea and Japan are also known for, then you're going to, shift this relationship from one of where, we're very cooperative with each other to one of competition.
Well, it's not necessarily the case because if you look at the trade relationship between China and Japan, China has surpassed Japan as the biggest trading partner for Japan. But actually, in a past year, China and Japan has also been talking about direct currency trading, bypassing the dollar. Based on what you just said, the U.S. and Japan should have a very lousy trading relationship, right? The U.S. is producing high-end products just like the Japanese does. But how do you explain the case that the U.S. never accused Japan of undervaluing its currency?
Okay, but going back to this point.
Actually, the U.S. encouraged Bank of Japan to devalue Japanese yen.
Okay, and then what will be?
How would you explain that? Why would they want to devalue Japanese yen?
What would be the regional currency then? I mean, would it be the yen or would it be the Chinese RMB?
Say it again.
What would be the regional currency? What would be the currency that would be?
I think both Japanese
have we
yen
already
and Chinese
come
RMB
to the stage
can
that we have to have an
role.
Asian currency to take over the U.S. dollar? No.
I don't think so. I mean, if you think about Japan 20, 25, 30 years ago, a lot of people were looking toward Japan as taking some leadership role in this region. But Japan didn't want to be, they didn't want that leadership role. They didn't want the yen to be the regional currency. And why should they? I mean, this is.
But China does. And Japan also wants to diversify from its reliance on the American Treasury debt. They want to buy some Chinese.
Why does China want to do this? I mean, it brings down responsibilities. There are costs.
But with more power, with more financial power, China should shoulder more responsibility.
I'm not sure that
China should
play
a bigger role in constructing a new financial
we haven't
model.
already opened the capital market.
But China is not looking for power right now.
But if China don't, what's the alternative?
They are still.
Let me finish.
They're still growing.
What's the alternative? The alternative is to continue to rely on the financial system.
So far, it seems that the world is still looking at the U.S. dollar as the dominant
currency. That's not the case. That's why the Japanese,
the
German central bank,
or the Japanese currency to take over, that will probably be a long shot.
But the thing is, German central bank has been asking for its gold back. The Indian central bank has been buying a lot of gold from the IMF, and there's a lot of currency swaps between China
have to end
and major
on
trading
this
partners.
note of currency. Well, thank you very much for your debates and perspective. We'll almost come to the end of the program, but before we go, let's take a sideways look at events here in Beijing and some of the more lighthearted, interesting thing away from politics. For that, let's turn to Mama.
Well, so indeed, there has been some quality discussion and even hot debate. So now let's take our breaths and relax a bit. We've been talking about how China's annual 2 sessions has been drawing global media attention, but today I'd like to introduce to you a cameraman who's been getting so much exposure over the past 4 years with his unique hairstyle. Well, his first public stunt was back in 2010. He showed up at the Great Hall of the People during a news conference for the Chinese foreign minister with a hammer and a sickle haircut. Well, a year later, that has changed. He walked into the Great Hall of the People with 5 stars, not any kind of 5 stars, but the exact copy of the national flag of China. And last year, in 2012, he was seen with the Chinese character Wen, that's Premier Wen Jiabao's family name, sculpted into his hair. And so what's his latest crazy creation? Well, he's gone all topical on us. After we've seen a smoggy and hazy day in Beijing for so much of the winter, this anonymous Chinese cameraman who works for a Japanese news agency has gone for the buzzword on air pollution, that's PM 2.5. So, very creative person. Zoe, are you having any plan to rethink your hairdo?
I think every journalist would appreciate standing beside a guy like this. It will make your long day endurable.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Mama. But that almost comes to the end of this program. The bigger you get, the harder it is to get even bigger. So China's economy has been the talk of the world because of its success. But whether it will continue to succeed is now an open question. It may take a lot making over and maintenance. We'd like to remind you we want to hear your views and your opinions. You can also watch our film, China Dream, at Sina Weibo at CCTV News. I'm Zhou in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.
Of a rising China and its possible contributions to the global system. Among them, how to avoid a currency war, a topic heated up recently with the quantitative easing going on in quite a number of countries such as US and Japan. Now, on that note, CCTV senior reporter Tian Wei talks to Zhu Guangyao on the sideline of the ongoing 2 political sessions in Beijing. Mr. Zhu is a CPPCC member and Chinese Vice Minister of Finance.
We certainly see the possibility of a currency war that was very much debated during the last G20 finance minister meeting. There's certainly a dangerous trend, isn't it?
Debate is there. That's whether just focus on domestic macro policy and give direct impact to the domestic economy. But we know now that globalization made all countries is interconnected. But we hope in the current situation, particularly faces as big challenge. Now that supply is higher than demand. We must have a way to solve this problem to keep global economy back to the right track.
China is now trying to find its specific position as a rising power in the world. When it comes to the area in which you work, what can be the contribution that China can make?
But as Secretary General Xi Jinping emphasized very clear, China is still developing country. Yes, China is the largest developing country in the world. Also, second economy in the world. We know we must do our effort to promote economic development. This is firstly for Chinese interest and the benefit for Chinese people's living standard improvement. But also, China as 1.3 billion people and a large economy.
Expanding domestic demand will continue to be a long-term strategy for China for long-term growth. Maintaining growth amid fledgling world economy. Jumping, the head of China's top economic planner, says China's macro control measures have been a success to avert an economic downturn. This is being buoyed by robust domestic demand.
There are 2 key ways to extend the domestic demand. First, consumption should be the fundamental factor in creating economic growth. Second, investment should play a critical role at the same time. As I've mentioned that we need to adjust the economic structure, because based on the last 2 years' experience, the domestic demand contributed a lot. Consumption's pulling effect to the economy surpassed investments. It had been noted by the society and should be our target in the future.
The country is still facing challenges on how to sustain the economic growth momentum and improve the quality of growth. Zhang stressed that unsustainable and unbalanced factors still exist in the current growth mode, and he says reform of government itself is the key.
按照18大的部署 The importance of economic system reform, or the core issue, should be to deal with the relationship between the government and the market. That is, we should let the market to play the fundamental role in resource allocation, while government fine-tunes policy.
And during the press conference, Xi Jinping outlined as much as 8 reform priorities, including tax reform, pricing reform, energy and resources, institutional reform, income distributional reform, and the financial reform. But he didn't mention any specific reform except for the pricing reform of fuel. Currently, China may change the retail oil prices when international oil prices change by more than 4% over 22 working days, a very rigid scheme. Jinping says the NDRC is studying a new mechanism to make it more flexible, and the 4% mark may be scrapped, and 22 working days may be shortened to make the fuel pricing mechanism more market-oriented. So, Mama, in the future, maybe China's rising population of car owners don't have to stand in long queues overnight at a gas station to fill their tanks before the NDRC raises oil prices. Back to you.
Of course, as active energy consumers, we do hope that day would come. And Winston, let's talk about the urbanization. That issue has been put under the spotlight even before this year's MPC and CPPCC started. So what did the NDR see about how to make urbanization more scientific, more inclusive, and more sustainable?
Yes, urbanization was raised at today's press conference. Actually, a reporter asked whether China would push forward urbanization in an overly aggressive manner like campaign. Jinping said China will focus on the quality of urbanization and advance urbanization in a prudent manner. And the NDRC is working with related government departments to compile a layout to guide the urbanization process, and it is expected to be released in the first half of this year. He also mentioned some of the guidelines. First is to expand the capacity of cities to accommodate industries, create employment, and provide public services and attract population. A second is to speed up the reform of China's household registration system to change the migrant workers into urban residents. And third is to conduct experimental projects and form a regional pattern and gradually expand to other parts of the country. Back to you, Mama.
All right, thank you so much, Wenxin, for your report, and we'll be checking with you again in the coming days. All right, now let's turn to some other issues. Amid the ongoing sessions of the MPC and CPPCC, there are quite some discussions about the role.
With a very, very close trade relation with other countries, China's development, particularly China's sustainable development, certainly contribute to the global economy. This win-win situation.
It is only natural that those that are still in power, quote unquote, is reluctant to leave, or at least to leave some space for the others to catch up. And therefore, can China put its own expectation or put its own hope with the actions taken from others?
So that's why CPC Secretary General Xi Jinping emphasized very, very clear. We want to develop this new model of country relations. We want this peaceful change. So that's our wish, and China really do this with very hard work. We also hope that other countries can have this good coordination. But very frankly, between China and US, and through economic dialogue, we had this very good policy coordination. This is one case to demonstrate U.S. as the largest economy in the world for last 60 years, and with the new economic power developed, such as China, if we can peacefully deal, we can very good communication, we really can share the mutual benefit. We said many, many times, Pacific is so large, that's large enough to let China, U.S. work together and benefit each other.
Well, thank you very much, Vice Minister Zhu. Thank you for being with us. Thank you so much.
Well, that was my colleague talking to China's Vice Finance Minister, Mr. Zhu Guangyao. It's now back to my colleague Zhou Yue and our studio guests. Well, Zhou Yue, as Mr. Zhu mentioned,
I'm Zhou in Beijing. China's economy has been described as a miracle, but no miracle can last forever. The country's economy is trying to make over and slow down, and the change could be painful and enduring.
And I'm Wang Mengmang. On today's show, China's top economic planner talks about boosting domestic consumption to keep the economy on track. All the latest from the CPPCC and MBC sessions to come.
The two biggest economies in the world, China and the U.S., are interdependent. We'll look at how their growing relationship has brought more trade tensions and disputes. I'm Philip Yen in Washington.
And I am Terry-Ann Chibet in Nairobi. Now, China is becoming a bigger player in the world economy, and we'll see how Chinese investment and cooperation in Africa is helping the continent's economic boom.
China's top economic planning body, the National Development and Reform Commission, held a press conference this morning. And our reporter Guanxin has been following this. For more details, let's talk to her. Well, Guanxin, you've been following this press conference, and the NDRC is usually closely watched during every year's CPPCC and MPC session because it makes and announces a lot of important economic policies. So what's fresh out of the Great Hall of the People?
Evening, Mama. Well, the NDRC Minister Zhang Ping said during the press conference that China will continue to rely on investment and consumption to drive future growth. Investment and consumption combined contributed 102.2% of GDP growth last year, while external demand dampened by sluggish economy in key export markets contributed -2.2%. Zhang Ping says